Welcome to this first in a series of lectures on macroeconomics. I'm Dr. Anthony Liberatore of Millikan University, and I'll be taking you through a series of lectures that hopefully will give you a basic understanding of how macroeconomies function. The first thing we'd like to do in this series is to look at a model that helps describe how the macroeconomy works. Let me ask you a question before we start. I suppose most of you are familiar with baseball or have played baseball. So suppose there's a runner on first base and the batter is up and there are no outs, and the batter hits a clean single into the outfield. Where does the runner go? Well, I believe that most of you here in the audience or listening told me that the runner moves to second base. Well, obviously you knew the answer to this because you could see the baseball diamond in your head and you knew the rules of the game. It wasn't a guess. So I know that I can ask you these questions and you have some conception of how the system works and you could give me an answer. Well, similarly in macroeconomics or any other phase of economics, you must have a model of how things work in order to analyze the situation. I'm going to give you another example. Suppose I tell you that the amount of oil coming into the country is reduced. What happens to the price of oil and gasoline? Well, you know from your experience, you have an understanding that the price of gasoline and oil will rise. However, you don't have, probably most of you don't have, a picture in your head of exactly how those forces are working. But you have some intuition of the result because you've gained this common sense understanding. Well, in economics, we have to fill that gap. We cannot work on the notion of I understand, but must be able to work through some model or conception of the economy step by step to really understand what's going on. So in macroeconomics, the first thing we're going to do is look at the circular flow model. And this is something that will help you understand the interactions in the economy. So let's take a look at this to get started. So now let's build a simple circular flow model. Firms produce everything in the economy: apples, automobiles, computer chips, etc. Households own everything in the economy. That's you and I. So firms, for example, can hire workers from households and in return pay a wage or a dollar flow back to the households. Households in turn can use this income or the wage dollars to buy products and services from the firms, and in return the firms supply the goods and services to households. So here we have a simple model, firms and households, and two sets of flows. We have a flow of resources or physical items in the inner circle, that is workers to firms and products to households, and in the outer components of the model we have the dollar flows, wages at the bottom and the purchase of products and services at the top. Well, the model would get a little messy if we had both of these flows all the time. So in subsequent presentations of the model, we're going to dispense with the physical flows and concentrate on the dollar flows. So let's do that in the next slide. Okay, so let's look at the circular flow model in a bit more detail. As we said, firms produce all the goods and services, and households own all the resources. That is, they own the firms, they own labor, land, etc. And in return for supplying these resources to firms, they receive income, which is denoted by Y at the bottom loop of this model. So households receive income, and they basically have two choices for it. They can spend it or save it. The spending in macroeconomics is called consumption, represented by the letter C. We consume food, clothing, entertainment, automobiles, durable goods, etc. So part of the income is used for consumption. The part that is not consumed is set aside in the form of savings. So the income that you have left has to go somewhere, and it tends to flow into financial institutions, represented here in the center in this green box, also called money markets. So income not consumed is saved and moved into financial institutions. There are three major financial institutions here. There's banking, stock markets and life insurance companies, we save our money in banks. We put it in a savings account, buy a CD, etc. And these deposits then are used by banks to fund the borrowing. So they lend the money out. So banks essentially are financial intermediaries. They're in-betweeners. They're in between the savers and the borrowers. And this is an important function in the economy because we have to repurpose or reuse that income that is set aside in the form of savings back into the economy for other purposes. So just looking at banks, for example, you deposit money in a bank. They have to use it because they're a company that has to pay wages and operate, etc. And they lend that money out. Now, you can lend money in all sorts of ways. If you think about it, we could borrow money for operating our business, for buying a car, for education. So there's a lot of borrowing going on. But the borrowing we want to focus in on here in the upper loop of the circular flow is money that is borrowed and used to expand our physical capabilities of production so that we can have larger productive capacity. And when money is borrowed for expanding productive capacity, we're going to call that investment. So investment has a particular meaning in this model. It is the borrowing of funds to expand productive capabilities. I know in savings, for example, when we set money aside and we put it in the stock market, we think of that as a financial investment, and that is fine, but the language of financial investment has a certain meaning. It's a form of our savings. For us, when we say investment in macroeconomics, we're going to mean the use of funds to expand productive capabilities. So there are two primary elements in here that expand our ability to produce. One is to borrow funds to build plant and equipment. So build a factory and add machines. Build an office building and put in machines, computers, etc. The use of borrowed money to expand our physical facilities of production, that is plant and equipment, is one of the forms of investment. The second form of investment that we're going to track is housing, because eventually if you want to be bigger, you're going to need more people and you'll need more housing. So funds that are borrowed for plant equipment and housing, these two elements, are referred to as investment, and it's investment in the physical structure of the economy so that we can expand our capabilities of production. Alright, so just to recap, households receive income. Some of it is spent, we call that consumption, and some of it is saved. We call that savings. The savings flows into financial institutions. That is, they are in-betweeners or financial intermediaries, and some of that savings is repurposed or reused in the economy in the form of investment in plant and equipment and housing that allows us to expand the productive capabilities of the economy. In the lower loop, we're going to add in government, and this is government at all levels, state, local, and federal. And this is complementary services to the private sector because we need contract law, we have to have a well-functioning system of private property, we provide defense, etc. Government's complementary to the private sector. We set the rules of the road so that private capital can maximize its usefulness and its return and create wealth. So complementary functions between government and markets, but the governments need revenue to function. They get revenue from all sorts of places, all kinds of taxes, property taxes, income taxes, etc., sales taxes, licenses and fees. We're just going to capture all of that in this little notion of taxes. That is, when income is generated from the production of goods and services, part of that income flow is leaking out into government coffers so it can be used for other purposes. So we have a leakage of revenue out of the income streams and into government. Now governments can do a lot of things with this. They can build roads, or they can support scholarships, they can give foreign aid, etc. And at state, local, and federal levels, there are a lot of uses for this revenue. But basically, there are two broad uses, which I'm going to show you here. Are transfers, and G which represents government purchases of goods and services. Well, let me just talk about the lower loop here, taxes and transfers. Here, visually, you can see that the income is moving out of the loop into taxes, and then it's being injected back into the loop in the form of transfers. Primary example of this would be Social Security. If you've ever received a paycheck, the first one, you were probably surprised that you didn't get all the money that you thought you earned because you had to pay taxes. And part of those taxes go in the form of Social Security taxes, that is, taxes for funding current retirees. So you pay taxes, Social Security taxes. That income that's coming out of your paycheck is not being set aside for your future, but it's being used today for current recipients of Social Security that's being transferred to the current retirees. Oh, here we have a loop of revenue coming out of the current income flows and being injected into the current income flows, and those are called transfers. This is a large part of what the federal government does. And there are many different kinds of transfers. But in addition to transfers, the government needs to operate, so it purchases goods and services. It's running the armed services, the agencies, etc., and in this case they're buying goods and services from the private sector. Well, these are the three basic things that go on in government. That is, the raising of revenue through taxes and other instruments, and the use of it for transfers back into the income stream. That's the redistribution of income, and then the purchase of goods and services to operate the government. On this simple model, we have a closed economy. That is, everything is internal to this particular economy. If it's a U.S. economy, this is all the things going on inside of it. But we know we trade. So we need to open up the model to take into consideration trade. So I'm going to add here the foreign trade sector. And as you can see, X represents exports and M represents imports. So if Boeing makes an aircraft and sells it overseas, that's an export. If we walk into a store and buy a bottle of French wine, that's an import. So the arrows here represent the physical flows rather than the dollar flows. The exports flowing out and imports flowing in. But if I look at this in a bit more detail, when an airliner is sold outside the country, the aircraft is delivered, that is, the good flows out, but the income comes back into the U.S. So rightfully, this arrow should be, export arrow should point income coming back into the U.S. I've got it pointing out because I thought it might be a little confusing on your first round to be seeing an export arrow pointing into the U.S. But I think you can handle this little deviation. Exports bring income into the country as the goods move out. Imports, which are coming into the country, are moving dollars out of the country. All right, so here's the basic circular flow model, and it has two loops, as you can see, the dark red at the top and the blue at the bottom. The bottom representing here our income and the top representing spending. So there are three major markets, macroeconomic markets. On the top here I've just popped up expenditure flows or product markets. So at the top loop shows where all the goods and services are being traded, and that is, we go out and purchase food and clothing and entertainment, etc. Investment is buying plant and equipment. So we have product markets. Of course, this is all based on supply and demand, correct? But we would call this expenditure flows or spending flows at the top. In the center is our second market, which our financial markets or money markets. And this is where income that is not consumed is flowing and being repurposed by banks, stock markets, and life insurance companies. The third market is at the bottom loop, the blue loop, and this is the income flows or factor markets. And here we have the movement of resources from households to firms, and in return the receipt of dollar flows of income. So three major macro markets: expenditure markets at the top, money markets in the middle, and factor markets at the bottom. Now I have a map. And this map is our ball diamond. It allows us to have at least a first round analysis of a change in the economy. So let's do that. Let's suppose that government raises taxes. Ceteris paribus. Well, this is the Latin for all other things being equal. That is, we're only going to change one thing. We're not going to think about how they're going to use the tax revenue. Only the fact that taxes have been raised and more revenue is flowing into the government. We're going to change one thing, hold everything else constant. That is ceteris paribus. So let's look at this one event and just go through the map and ask ourselves what could be happening. So if I raise the tax rate, there's more revenue leaking out of the income streams into government. It means the income streams that are flowing to households have been reduced. So households have less income. With less income, households are likely to also reduce consumption and savings. Reducing savings is somehow going to affect money markets, and we can go through that. But reducing consumption, we can see that immediately means that there's less demand for the goods and services being produced by firms. So if households are purchasing fewer goods and services, the inventories in firms build up, and they're likely to cut back on production. That's fewer hours or fewer people, which means less production. There is less income. So here we get the first kind of round of interconnections, and it's our baseball diamond. We can see where the runner is going. So we need to memorize this and always go back to it when we want to get a first blush view of the connections in the economy. Right? I'll try another one. Suppose households decide to save less of their current income and spend more. Well, we've just seen that if you increase consumption, this will increase production and increase income. So we have a first round effect. It also means that if there is less savings, there's less available to go to borrowers, which may mean that since savings are scarce and people want to use the savings for investment, that maybe interest rates would rise. So we begin to see these interconnections. So there are many different situations we could look at here now that we have a map of the macroeconomy. So memorize this, make sure you understand it so that we can use it over and over again as we go through the lectures on macroeconomics. Alright, so we have a fairly detailed and robust view of the macroeconomy. And now let's see how we can use this. One of the things we can do with this picture is ask ourselves, how can we measure all of the production in the economy? Well, we can look at firms and add up all the shoes that are produced, all the automobiles, etc. But instead of doing that, we can measure all the spending in the economy and make adjustments so this is a good representation of production. So here's a little equation up in the left-hand corner of the slide that says GDP, that is gross domestic product, gross meaning total, domestic being on our shores, and product meaning production. So everything that's produced on our shores, the total amount of things that were produced, gross domestic product, is equal to these spending streams or expenditures. Consumption plus investment plus government spending plus exports minus imports. So consumption by households, food, clothing, cars, etc. Investment by firms and households, so plant, equipment, and housing. The third element of this is an inventory adjustment that we'll talk about a little bit later. But the primary elements are expanding our physical capacity to produce, so plant, equipment, and housing. Government purchases of goods and services, not the transfers, but the purchases of goods and services. And exports minus imports. So if we're consuming things, we might not be consuming everything that's produced in the U.S. So Boeing aircraft, for example, are not all purchased by domestic firms. So we're not going to capture all the things that are produced, so we have to add in exports. So we measure these things at our borders and we add them back on because we've missed them in our C plus I plus G. So we add exports in. Of course, our consumption, C plus I plus G, might capture spending that's on things that were made outside of the U.S., that is imports, for example, the French wine. So we net imports out. So we can measure the total production in the economy, that is gross domestic product, from the upper loop of the circular flow, that is from the expenditure flows. We can measure that as C plus I plus G plus X minus M. And again, this is something that we'll use over and over. So this should become second nature to you, so you should remember this piece. Another piece of information that we can glean from this model is that the loops, the top and the bottom loops, are equal, so that gross domestic product, all the expenditures on the upper loop, are going to equal the income generated in the lower loop. So if I tell you that GDP, that is total production, was 17 trillion, I'm also telling you that income produced in the economy is equal to 17 trillion, and we'll investigate this relationship a little bit later. But here at the bottom I've introduced another equation, that is Y of income is equal to wages, that's going to labor, rent going to land or landlords, interest going to capital, that is if you borrow money you pay interest, and the money that firms are borrowing or raising is called capital. So capital, money that's borrowed, has an interest payment, and profit to the owners or the entrepreneurs being risk takers. So the major flows of income in the economy being generated, that if it was 17 trillion in income, is going to households which own everything in the form of wages because they own their own labor, rent because households own the land, interest because we own the banks and other capital is coming from us in terms of savings, and profit, which is the residual or leftover for firms, going to the owners. So wages, rent, interest, and profit. If I look at the total accounting system, there'll be other elements in here that we would add in to make this a complete capturing of income. But for now, I'm just interested in the major relationships and the notion that production that's generated in a given year is also equal to the income that's generated in a given year. So production of 17 trillion creates income of 17 trillion, and this income is flowing to households in the form of wages, rent, interest, and profit. And that income is going to what we call the four factors of production: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. So the blue flows here are the factor markets. And now we have a nice baseball diamond of the macroeconomy that gets us on the same page with respect to our visualization of the segments, sectors, and interconnections in the macroeconomy, and provides a basis for us to learn other things about the economy and to analyze what's happening. So commit this to memory, and we're going to use it continuously. So as we talk about this in later lectures, I'm going to assume that you have this picture in your head and that I don't have to continually re-diagram it. Alright, so here's the circular flow model, our home base in our game. Now let's look at these definitions a little bit. I have a slide here that you can to summarize the elements in the model, so you can get this from the course material or download it, but here you have it on the slide. I have three components here that we're going to look at. Click those all up here. I have firms. So firms produce everything, but just to remind us, they have different legal forms. They can be incorporated. It could be a corporation like Ford Motors, which sells shares so that we could be a partial owner of the company. And we have unincorporated legal forms of business. That is, they don't have shareholders in the sense of Ford Motor Company, but it could be a single person selling apples, doing lawns, building homes, be a sole proprietorship, or it could be several people together working to create this company, and that would be a partnership. So we have different legal forms of business. Government, as I said, is at all levels, state, local, and federal. They raise revenue, which I've lumped all in the category of taxes, but there are all sorts of taxes. There are income taxes, property taxes, licenses, sales taxes, etc. This is all lumped into this revenue generation. And we have transfers. So Social Security, these are movements of current income to current recipients. The leakage is an injection of income. Social Security, foreign aid, Medicaid, scholarships, etc. Any funds that are to be taken from current taxpayers to current tax recipients. And finally, financial institutions or money markets here. And I've got 3 listed: banking sector, stock markets, and life insurance companies. So just a quick discussion of these. The banking sector, of course, takes deposits from customers and lends to borrowers, and I think you all have a conception of that in your head. And when people borrow, and they have to pay interest on that, so that's interest on the borrowed funds. And we can see how that works. Stock markets, of course, are where we have shares of stock being traded. So if a firm wants to raise capital, it could sell shares into the stock market. These are called equities because we're owners in the business. So there's a trade in equities. But if a firm wants to borrow money, you can go to a bank, of course, and get a banknote just like we would. But they could also sell IOUs to people. So in the stock market, firms selling IOUs would issue an IOU, and the IOUs are called bonds. So in the stock markets, we have the trading of stocks and bonds. Life insurance companies are also an intermediary because they're selling, for example, a life insurance product. So you pay premiums in on a regular basis, and in case there's a death, then insurance companies will pay on that benefit. But in the meantime, they've received the funds and they must put them to use. So essentially these are funds that have been saved. They've been moved to a premium. It's a financial investment, a premium in an insurance policy. And the insurance company then will repurpose these funds. They'll invest them. They can invest them in the stock market. They can invest them in a real estate development. They can lend the money to real estate developers or to farmers, etc., etc. So they are also a financial intermediary. So here are some of the sectors in the market that we talked about. I also have here a listing of all the symbols that we've used in the circular flow. G for gross domestic product, consumption being durable goods, non-durables, and services. Savings, which is essentially income not consumed. Investment has 3 components. Plant and equipment, which would be non-residential. Housing, which would be residential. And the change in inventories or net inventories, which will make more sense to us later when we see what is in GDP. And government spending for goods and services. This is not the transfers. So here are some definitions, mostly on the upper dark red loop of the model, the expenditure flows. At the bottom we have the income flows. So income, Y, is equal to wages, rent, interest, and profit, which is going to the factors of production: labor, land, capital, and entrepreneurship. And I just have those here spelled out for you so you can have those. And then here we've talked about capital, interest going to capital. That's money borrowed by firms. And the cost of borrowed funds is the interest paid. So here's a basic view of the circular flow model that we're going to use for our macro analysis. And we're going to carry this forward in Lecture 2. In Lecture 2, we're going to look at GDP in a little more detail. We'll look at national income and product accounts, And so when I say this, you should get the picture of the ball diamond in your head. I've got the circular flow. Where is income? It's at the bottom loop. Where are products? It's at the top loop. And you know that these two things are equal. So when we're going to look at the national accounts of income flows at the bottom, these have to be equal to the product flows expenditures at the top. So we have national income and product accounts. And the circular flow helps us organize our perception of these. We also want to know what GDP measures, what's in it. So I said it was all our production in a given year. We'll take a peek at that and look into it. Get a kind of a first blush measure of this. We also want to know how we're measuring the GDP, whether it's in the dollars we're looking at today or the dollars from another year, because we know we have inflation. So if we're thinking about inflation now, new idea, we have to look at how prices are changing, or price indexes, and we have to measure how those indexes are changing. So we're going to go to this in the next lecture. So thank you for listening to the first lecture. Your job now is to make sure you understand the circular flow model and you know its components, so we can talk to one another on that. And when I ask you a question, you have the ball diamond in your head, and we can analyze things together. So thank you, and I'll see you in the next lecture.